All right, Adrian. I'm sure you didn't intend anything amiss, but the way that it feels like looking at this opening page here with a small, say classical style complement, and then just gradually adding more and more instruments without any warning, until finally we have this, massive, enormous orchestra by the last screen. You're just not giving me any warning, my friend. Right? Like these instruments should be listed at the beginning, right? Like right on this page, even if they're not used. Right? So all right. So just this has not been an issue with the entries so far in this challenge, and it's such a rare thing that it's the kind of thing I probably wouldn't even put into a checklist. But really, folks, all right, just make sure you tell me all the instruments on the beginning screen. Right? It's not that I look through these these entries one after another, just going from page to page and talking about them without having looked at the score in with any kind of studying or anything. That's not it. It's just that you have to, you really do have to tell us what's going on the first screen. I think that's just fair play, right, for your score reader. And just in a practical sense, of course, were this score intended for performance, then absolutely, the your overworked orchestra librarian and production people are going to just look at the first page, and they're not going to be at all aware of the trumpets and trombones and everything else, all the extra percussion and so on by the last pages, right? So just be aware, even though I'm assuming that this is this score has the look of Dorico to it. So I would just say, like, even though Dorico and Sibelius too, they give you the option of not having a first page that has all the instruments. Just always make sure that your first screen or first page or first whatever always lists all the instruments. All right. But I mean, to a certain degree, I know, Adrian, you're just trying to be helpful, right? Because that, with fewer instruments per screen, then you can have a larger staff size, and that is really really good for me in order to analyze it. But maybe if the first screen had just had everything possible on it, right? I mean, looking at it, it's really a romantic sized orchestra rather than a classical sized orchestra, right? You've got your triple flutes, and same with your oboe family and clarinet family, bass clarinet, English horn, definitely. Even though the English horn was around in the classical period, it really wasn't that established as a orchestral instrument or as a symphonic instrument anyway. You see it in some divertimenti and other in some operas and so on. That's because they didn't have clarinets yet, right? So they needed something to fill in the space between the bassoons and the English horns. But then it would just make an incredibly buzzy sounding woodwind harmony. So yeah, just and then you've got your three trumpets, your four horns, two trombones, three trombones plus tuba, excuse me, and then timpani, bass drum, and tambourine, snare drum, alternating, glockenspiel, and harp, just for these two bars or this one bar. So look, Adrian, I see the intent of this very very clearly. That you were just showing me different treatments of different bits of material, right? And not necessarily something that was intended to hang together as one single piece. You do know what I mean? I mean, that's what I sense here. Now, of course, if you were orchestrating both movements and the first movement used a lot more of these instruments, and then they came back in at the end of the second movement. Did I say first movement? First movement. And then the end of the second movement, then that would be one thing, right? But then you have to sort of ask yourself in terms of economy, right? Like what orchestra would pay to have a harpist show up for one bar, right? Is there any way of economizing this massive tutti? Like there are lots of functions that are doubled in other parts. Would it be possible to trim all of this down to just a pair of horns and a pair of trumpets, right? And and then just trust to maybe four pairs of winds and your regular string complement, and maybe timpani, to express everything that needed to be expressed, right? And that way, just really keeping on track with something manageable. And the reason why I'm saying this is is that I, in defiance of the concept of this entry being different treatments of different sections with different orchestration approaches, purely, right, rather than having something that holds together as one full movement. I counter that with with the assertion that your quality of orchestration really deserves a chance to be read, to be performed, everything else, right? So to my way of thinking, I feel it would have been better if you had fewer instruments, did less experimentation, more integrated orchestration, and then delivered something that could have a chance of have a shot at being performed, right? As it is right now, this movement being so brief and the orchestra being so large at the end, I feel that it would be a very hard sell, right, to get this to be performed as a piece of repertoire in a concert music setting, right? Like maybe a reading where all of these instruments are available, and you got your shot, you got your 10 minutes with the orchestra, and they play through it, and then a few of the players will say, hey, this is hard on me, this isn't, this is, I felt that this was really strong scoring for the clarinet or whatever. And then they work out quickly any problems, penciling in a couple of things, and then they play it again, and you get your little recording, and you can think about it, right? They're filming it so you can watch the YouTube video afterwards, right? And make your own notes about it, brag about it to your friends, right? So yeah, so so I am going to just judge it on your particular approach, right? Which I'm, and I forgive me if I'm completely wrong in my assumptions about like the purposes of it, of of starting so small and then getting bigger and bigger and bigger. If I'm wrong in my assumption that this is a sort of a kind of a sketch based sort of a thing, just kind of playing with different ideas and different orchestrations and so on, then I apologize. Okay, but I'm going to just completely take it on that particular outlook, and I'm not going to judge it on like things like proportions and everything else, right? And that kind of workability, right? So we just talk about the functionality of the orchestration. Does it hold together? How does how do certain things work? Do I see any particular problems and so on? I don't see a huge amount of problems. So I'll be mainly pointing out like the different approaches that you're using, so that this is very useful to orchestrators, and also just by talking through it with you, maybe we can. Maybe what I say will be useful to you, because it really looks like you had a lot of stuff worked out, right? Okay. So just like before with Frank Wallace's score, this new approach, I'll be looking at the beginning from double A to double C, those first two sections, double A and double B, I should say. And then after that, we'll just be jumping through the different sections to look at the way that the music is recapped, right? And then to compare the different approaches and see like what new lessons we can learn from it. What how did Adrian develop his material orchestrally and everything else, right? Which will finally lead to that massive part at the end. Okay, so starting off, you have glommed on to my particular instincts in my evaluation criteria. Do the shifts of dynamics and registers imply contrasts of texture, right? And absolutely, you scored them out that way. You've got your double reads here in a direct transcription, doubled by strings. Here I would make the whatever slurring that you're doing match in your strings, right? So because like otherwise you're doing something like this, like your oboes are going ba ta, and then flutes ta 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 ta, right? Okay, and here the violins is bum bum bum, right? Is down up down. So if you really want that, then it should be replicated in the winds. And if you want the smoother da da, then you should have that shared by the violins. It's really no problem for them. One thing I really want to point out, I forgot. I was going to point this out right at the very beginning, and that is you have this tempo of 120 rather than like 138, 144, which is more like allegro vivace, right? You know, like allegro vivace is pushing towards a presto, right? So 120 is more like allegro moderato, not allegro vivace. So, or allegro non troppo, right? So you know it's more like the tempo of the first movement, right, rather than the second. Now, making it this slow means that there are a lot of things, a lot of different patterns, and a lot of different. The main thing especially is just the little slurs, slurring in 16th note tuplets, right? You know, the die 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 kind of thing. That becomes a lot easier to do and a lot more possible. So I'll grant you this, you know, but I wouldn't call it allegro vivace. Okay. So yeah, so just watch out for make the slurring match. See, I noticed that here you did match the slurring, so maybe you just forgot to put the slurs in here. But just watch out for those things, right? Just that's one of those things I would put on my checklist of things to aspects to proofread for, right? And especially like in these challenges as we've started to take on longer and longer stretches of material, even like two movements in this latest one. Just like the more proofreading that you can do, right, the better, and yet there will be less and less time because of the amount of material. So I understand. So yeah, so we've got the same approach going both times, adding English horn here. So, but it's like you still have that all all double reeds matched up with your string section. And one thing that I would say is that, like, I mean, I can see like jumping the double bass up over an octave here really does give the sense of lifting the music upwards, and yet by having the second bassoon stay so low, we don't get the sense of elevation that we might have, right? Maybe just using a first bassoon on the higher E flat and having your winds be up a little bit further, right? Whether in an inversion or whether in like just taking it up a full octave might be a way of like reimagining that. Okay, and then forte, piano in like flutes, clarinets, and bassoons. Seeing as how this really is, this is a modernistic, or I would say neoclassical kind of an interpretation with English horns and bass clarinet and pretty much chromatic horns. I'm not really seeing much of a with all these A's and so on, and I'm not really seeing any kind of dedication to a natural horn approach, right? Then I think that you could achieve even more contrast here by having this played in horns, right? So strings and double reeds, ba-da-dum, and then flute, clarinet, and horns, bum bum ba dum bum bum, with the bum bum ba bum in like second horn, right? And then here back to double reeds, da da da, and then same thing, like keep it in clarinet and so on, and I like the idea of oboe kind of cushioning right in here. But you could have actually had this as two horns, and put this back in clarinets, right? Dun, 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 dun. Anyway, just a thought. And this is really lovely. Just the oboe family all by itself. And here I would absolutely put in a meno, even though you're already so slow here. Da da da, bum ba da da, a tempo. Da 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 da, and this is so playable. All this is beautifully worked out. In a situation like this, where you have the second voice coming in, I would actually start the upward stems and the second voice. Like I would put in the this over the top, and then like the second voice rests below and so on, and then this piano crescendo to forte makes a whole lot more sense in the second voice and so on. So and then forte here in the first voice, and yeah, just a cleaner way of doing it. Yeah, and I like this to a degree. Like you've got this pizzicato boop beep boop doop beep boop beep 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 boop boop boop, right, and then this is a little strange, like the character of the bass changing. So, and I know that you're trying to get some variation out of it, right? And then coming back in here in quarter notes against the eighths and so on. Um, just so long as you are willing to deal with that it's like, yes, okay, so the variation freshens the material, but will the changeover be something that just like jars the audience's attention? Here, the focus really is so nicely placed on the on the higher instruments that it's not a big issue. And I like this little the horn in the middle, but I can't help feeling that there's just a little bit of like this is really strange, crescendo to nothing, right? So you got to proofread your scores a little bit more. Here, I think that you could have doubled your French horn part here, the solo part with the viola, and made it a little less, like, just to soften the edge off of this and also to engage those violists, right? Might have been a way of keeping the string sound a little bit, not so separated, right? That because all right, so one of the problems with Beethoven, okay, and this is something that was pointed out by his contemporaries. It's a quality that we now look at from the future and say there's nothing wrong with it. What the hell's wrong with them? What's the hell is wrong with his critics? But what they criticized were things like the Hammerklavier and like passages like this in the original piano score and so on, where the hands would get further and further apart, right? They didn't like that. They felt that there should be like that as the orchestra as the hands spread apart, like the further apart your hands got, the more random that was, the less integrated the sound was, right? And of course, like if you just look at like late Liszt and Chopin and then the people that followed them, like some of the really great impressionist and modern piano composers and so on, that all is just a bunch of baloney. And kind of having that aesthetic sort of rule your concepts of pianism leads to a very limited sound picture to always have to fill in the middle, right? But then again, like there was a whole psychology or a whole approach to orchestra that you also had to do that with your orchestra, right? And it's true in some senses. Like if you want to sort of cultivate a certain kind of a sound, it's a good idea. But it doesn't always have to be that way. But I would say, like in this case, I think to having like a fuller, like nicely spread string kind of a sound with a middle voice, perhaps doubling the horn here, or perhaps like bracing it or outlining it. Do you know what I mean? This is really cool. This little doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. Doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. Yeah, just adding a little bit of extra pressure in there. Yeah. So here, I'm just looking at the dynamics of this passage. Crescendo to forte, right? Forte, forte. So, are you saying that this is supposed to be like a classical accent? In which case, you don't even need to mark forte since you are working in a modernist environment, and just put an accent mark on there, right? I think that's really what you mean. However, if you really do want to push forward and have like a much more emphatic ending to this passage, then you should go up to a fortissimo and have a crescendo over the last bar or the bar before or the two bars before, right? And it just makes a lot more sense. Okay. So my criteria that apply to this say, smooth, not awkward. I think you've achieved that. Maintaining energy throughout, yes. Textural and dynamic expansion, like I said, like I think you need to, fill things out. I think this French horn, you don't have to say French horn, you can just say horn. This this little horn line right in here does a lot of lifting in it. It's really great. I do think violas would be very helpful there. And then, yeah, repeat inevitable, not just replayed. And then, and you change the quality of color there with the cellos coming in, and that's really great. Ending phrase with finality, framing the next part, right? So I feel that you do, and once again, yeah, just a little bit of extra pressure there going to an accent or maybe to a fortissimo or something like that. Certainly, I think a crescendo, at least on this last written A in your horn, your first horn. All right, and then, we go to this die, and I think that works pretty well. I think it's interesting the way that I think that there's something a little weird here. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, you change things around a little bit. I think that you should have been going to D sharp E here. Maybe that was a mistake, right? But it's really audible. Like the difference between the piano score and this and the way that you treated this bar right here, right? So maybe it's just a teeny little error, but if you go back over this and revise it, I would take these two notes and put them here, right? Like they are in the piano score. Because it breaks the pattern too. And it calls attention to itself, and that's not what you want. You want this to be just like a irrepressible flight of fancy, right? It's what's lovely about this movement is that I feel it's a callback to the Beethoven of 15 years before, right? When he first came to Vienna, and he was an improviser, right? He would go to, they'd have these parties, they'd have these events, they'd have these concerts, and he would just go there, and it was sort of like, Second City, but for music, right? Give me a theme. And they would say, hey, do you know XYZ from that one opera by, Mozart, by Gluck or whatever? And he'd say, oh yeah, sure. And then he would play the theme, and then he would turn it into a fugue, and then he would turn it into, a fantasy, or an etude or something like that. He just had the most amazing fertile imagination, and I think that in this movement, that's what he's calling back to, is the way that he would just technically just be brilliant at it, explosively brilliant. And that's what all these little flights of fancy are about with the and that's why, like, that's part of the challenge of this part of the evaluation, is to how can we interpret those in ways that are playable for the musicians, right? And effective orchestration. Okay, so if that's just our, there are all these concerns, like direct transcriptions might prove impractical. Does interlocking / independent scoring between orchestral sections support headlong momentum, but with precision and clarity? We'll talk about that when we turn to the next screen. Choice of instruments dependent on where a passage is positioned between other passages, or dependent on dynamics, direction of line up or down. How do these sections lead back to the other sections dramatically, etc.? Okay, so those are all, valid criteria for us to think about. So with all those things in mind, we're just looking at the way this is set up, this is all, very, very playable. And there's almost zero need for you to be trading off because like there's the first violins just can easily go, right? Do you know what I mean? They've got no problem, right? Just continuing on, harem scarum, right? Um, they're not using themselves up like a woodwind player. Like they don't need to recoup their breath or anything like that. Right? And there's nothing about this technically that will twist their fingers into knots, so that they have to, they need a slight break, right? So unless you wanted that effect of like trading off between sections of the orchestra, and in a classical sense, with the classical orchestra seating the first violins to the left of the conductor, the seconds to the right, then that's a sort of an interesting reason, right? All right, and then it just continue on trading between the players, right? Um, Maybe if there had been some trading off, like once you get a little lower between violas, say violas and first violins, like would create more of a contrast. But then I really love in here where you're going from violas to firsts to cellos and so on. It's less practicable than you might think. Right? But I do like the essence of stepping on each other's toes that you've got right in here. Right? Now, I was hoping that some of my participants would pick up on the fact that most solo pianists who play this score as composed by Beethoven, not orchestrated, have a slight pause before they tear into it and before they come out of it, right? Just to help, just a like a pausa, right? Like a breath that places the downbeat of the next bar, or that just takes a slight breath to kind of clear the air right here, not necessarily breaking the rhythm, but just a teeny bit of a stretch there, so that the fierce chord here can clear the concert hall, right? At least in terms of the piano. And then, of course, with the orchestra, it's even more important, like especially if you've got like a big thumping timpani note right there, boom, da, 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 then you would really want a pausa, right? So you don't really absolutely need it here, and I really like the way that you have this little snare drum. So I think that's a pretty effective way of disregarding the need for any kind of pause and placement, right? So now we have gotten to the point 4 bars before double C, of where we're going to break these different sections down and just compare them as we go through. All right. So we already looked at double A. It's like a battery. With the double reeds and the strings and so on, alternating with the flute and clarinet and bassoon and so on, right? And then you kept it fresh, like the reactions were orchestrated differently each time, and I really respect that. And then just the double reeds, da, 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 then strings at ba da dum bum bum, right? Okay, all right. So so now let's compare that to 4 before double C. Now, the reason why I put double C here rather than here is just because I wanted to give those participants who I think it was at the a dotted semi-brev or the semi-brev level, a little of just a few more bars, right? So that they could like wrap up their idea from before, and then I could evaluate how well this section went back into that section without any quibbling around, right? So that's the reason why this really should be here, right? If this were a regular bit of concert music, and if I wouldn't blame anybody if they had plans to have this performed or have their entry performed, moving this over here. Okay, so and of course here are the slurs, right? So why aren't they at the beginning? Probably just a proofreading error. Okay, so here you are just doing shifts of dynamics at the beginning rather than shifts of orchestral color, right? But you're adding the snare drum, a little bit of bass drum, a punch there. Yeah, yeah. Okay, that all makes sense. It's very martial. Did you notice? Like it really sounds military all of a sudden. And then and I feel that this is really lovely. The sforzando, you know, heavy brass here, and strings and so on. Yeah, I mean that's lovely. The heavy brass are gonna really blast over the strings. So I might recommend here going SFP, right? And then just allowing the strings to be bigger here. So you get this, right? And while the strings are going, right? And then this is lovely. Then the reaction, right? With the full wind section stretched out over, adding the octave on top here with the flutes is similar to what you did before, and then your strings here. I almost feel like you could have gone to octaves here, just octaves on the melody with the, with your first and second violins, doubling the top note of these thirds here in your flutes and oboes, and then you would have gotten a kind of a full sound here, rather than being so wind heavy on top. But of course, I mean, if that's what you wanted, then that's what you achieved, right? And then the little part which I say meno, a moment of restraint worth preserving, implying further textural contrast and tempo adjustment. And I just feel that would work so well, don't you think? A little bit of meno here and then a tempo there, and especially just like how beautifully pastoral. It's like a little pastoral moment here. Flute. First clarinet under there, a little bit of glockenspiel. Yeah, and also just those three notes a little slower, right? It just gives some time for that to sink in, just a teeny bit of restraint, and then back to dun 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 bum bum, right? And then this leads forward to this very very beautifully, I feel. So the connection to the next section, that's not a question here, but we're not going to get to this little part right here yet. We are going to stick to our evaluation kind of approach by jumping to the next statement at double E. All right. So we've seen the different approaches. Like it was the first time it was strings and double winds and double reeds, and then alternating with clarinets and so on, and then was all strings, and then adding heavy brass, and then the full wind section, right? So now we've got a really massive tutti right in here, except no horns or lower winds. So I actually felt that like you've got so much weight here with a bass trombone that like you obviously and bass clarinet here. You just really don't need, you don't really need those lower instruments, right? But I will have to warn you, combining straight heavy brass here with strings and all winds but no bassoons is going to give you a very bright sound, like almost like onion skin paper kind of a sound, right? But you have tamed your your heavy brass here. This could just be done as single voice intervals, right? On sharing a stem, right? And you don't need to put that way. You don't need to put the dynamic marking on top anyway, right? Same thing. I guess here that it makes more sense, but you could have had this first voice intervals going to a due here, right? So I guess it's just a. I guess this may be a reflection of the way that flows work, right? I don't know. Okay, then especially with piccolo as this top instrument up here, so high above the flutes, right? So I think that like were your were your heavy brass here not tempered a little bit by being marked down 1 degree, then this would be almost shatteringly brittle the way that it's set up. Still slightly dangerous, the piccolo way so high up there, right? But it's still all right. I do like the first violins filling in the gap between the flute and the piccolo, right? So that's good. And then these other instruments doubling what's going on here and so on. So I feel that that's fairly effective, right? But it's a little on the edge. But maybe that's what you want. And then of course you've got the reaction piano just in the strings, bum, 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 bum. And then kind of the same orchestration again. This time adding the bassoon family and horns and tuba on the bottom there. Right, and then like you're still tempering your brass section. You might be able to mark up your horns here to forte with the way that this is all spread out. Yeah, and very wise. See, like here you're going to just to straight octaves in your strings, and I would just point out that where the violas are placed right now, they're just invisible, with so much weight in the middle here. I would just have the violas double the second violins. Watch out for this. I'm seeing this in some Dorico scores, violin 1 and then violin in the abbreviations. Right? How did that happen? Should be violin 2, right? Okay. This is one of these things. Like I wish that I had time to go through every entry and proofread, like do a little bit of basic proofing and then send it back to the orchestrator and say, do XYZ, right? Or XYZ if you're in the Commonwealth. But yeah, I just don't. So like I kind of have to mention it during the evaluation, but I'm trying not to get too tied up in it. All right, and then the little, the bum bum ba dum bum bum, and I just feel this is so strong right in here. Bassoons and trombones working together here, a little bit of bass clarinet and English horn. I feel it's just so powerful, right? And then the second bassoon here and bass trombone, a little bit of tuba down there. So that's nice. I'm not totally convinced by this slur here, but like if you're really getting da 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 da, I just feel that like if you really want this to be kind of more kind of Waldhorn. Do you know what? If you want to have that kind of heroic, woodsy, kind of lusty, man of the earth kind of a sound here. I think this slur kind of works against that. All right, and then we've got our little da da da, and here once again, Mano. I think would work great, especially with the little glockenspiel here, and it's so charming the way that you've scored this right in here, Adrian. Like with the little flute family and the oboe family all working together. It's so cute. Da da da, and then odd tempo. Bum bum ba dum bum bum. All right, and then we'll talk about this and then since this is just all strings going straight into all strings here, once again the drama and the scope fits perfectly into what you have planned, right? All right, so no issues there. All right, so now let's look at bar 150. Wow. Okay. Okay, so that takes us right to the kind of final statement of the rondo theme, and you have something very similar to what you did before. This time with bassoons and so on, bass clarinet working together. We got a duet. I don't know if I would say a duet with bassoon and tuba. I would just have like split stems and first and second voice. Maybe it's just like because like a duet sort of that always sort of seems to me, in when you have the bass trombone and tuba part conjoined like that, it always seems to me like you're saying that it's two of the same kind of instrument, right? But like technically, it is no problem with it. I just think, mentally, it's one of the reasons why I feel that having bass trombone and tuba on separate staves is the way to go. I mean, it's better. It's better to have all three trombones on one staff. If you have kind of chordal things, than it is to have bassoon and excuse me. It's better to have all the trombones on one staff playing chords than it is to have bass trombone and tuba on the same staff. But like it's all that's all just petty stuff. And Adrian, if you're just trying to conserve vertical space, I can understand. So yeah, so it's a slightly different color than the way that you imagined it at first, but like once again, with this much going on in the middle voice, and and piccolo brought in here again, and so much harmonization in the winds and so on, I just almost feel like strings as octaves would give you a more satisfying sound here. So ba da dun, right, and then reaction in flutes, English horn, bassoon. Right, so it's a slightly different configuration than at the beginning, but it's a really lovely bright sound. And then once again, kind of same approach as before. Pardon my tuneless singing along, and I love the octaves here in your horns. Yeah. I wonder if the harmonization here is powerful enough to see, the thing is this the viola is really weak here. I think try this with your mock-up. Try taking this right in here, this little harmonization here, putting it in the bassoons to double what's going on here in the lower strings, and then run it. It's just that with the intensity of the octaves here and the horns and so on, I just feel that it's just not strong enough with clarinets on top and viola and cello on the bottom. Just with the viola, right? There's no problem with the cello, but I just feel it's either that or have your horns play pianissimo, and same thing with the tuba. Like here, you haven't adjusted this. That's why sort of in the mock-up it was a bit loud, right? Okay. All right, and then we have our little possible meno. Da, da, da. I love the glockenspiel. Right. Now with glockenspiel, there's kind of no need to put in any kind of, any kind of slurs or anything. It just is a naturally slurring instrument, right? Everything sort of smooshes together. Yeah, and it's so cool, like the color here when you put the glockenspiel on top. Right. And that just leads forwards to bum ba da dum bum bum. Now I'm not going to get into this too much, just because this leads into this final section, which this is the part right here. Listening to Spencer Myer play this section. Well, okay, so I stumbled onto Spencer Myer's interpretation of this, and I just felt it was so perfect in terms of expressing the possibilities of an orchestral arrangement, and that's why I made it my like the basis for a lot of people, to as the reference, right? the main reference. So he convinced me with the opening of the first movement, and then the elegance of the statement, of the exposition and everything else. And then when I listened to him play just this last little part, right, this little development, that convinced me. It's like, this has got to be, like, if I do this as an orchestration challenge, this has got to be, this has got to be the piano version that I use, and this convinces me that it can be orchestrated, right? There are all these different bits of Beethoven sonatas that are very orchestratable. Of course, there's the Appassionata that's been orchestrated many times, and then there's the second. There's there like a little rondo movement of the is it the 110? I think it's like either the 109 or the 110. Bum 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 bum. Dun 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 dun. It sounds so Brahmsian to me. Of course, Brahms is sounding like that, but yeah. Okay, so anyways, we'll talk about this in a minute. All right, so let's jump back now. All right. Okay. Now we're going to talk about. We're going to look back at the way that Adrian orchestrated this, right? So I've already talked about, the need for a little bit more filling in here with the violas, perhaps. How great this French horn part was. This clarinet thing works really well, especially at the this curtailed tempo and so on. The little touches here of flute and so on. So just fix that in your mind, the way that Adrian scored this, and then also like the shift in timbre here for that little bass line part, right? Pizzicato basses versus bowed cellos and so on. All right, so now, let's also review, my criteria for this. Is this going to be, smooth, not awkward? These patterns. Will there be any kind of textural or dynamic expansion? Will there be a maintenance of the nervous energy throughout? Right. Is the repeat of this bass line, does it feel inevitable, not just replayed? And does it end the phrase with finality? Yeah, like bum 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 bum, which will frame the next part, right? And so on, right? So keep all those things in mind. Now we're going to look at the two reiterations of this idea. Okay, so first one at bar 43, right? Da da da. Right. So here is a part that, if this were at 144 or 168 or whatever, I would just say forget it. No, it's just like, you just figure out a new way of doing this. Maybe don't slur by the beam, like having beam groups of 4 16th notes, and have it go da 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 rather than da 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 da. That's very, very. It's hard to get it to sound natural at a fast tempo, right? Like, you can get the players to get it down and to nail it exactly right, but it takes some rehearsal before it feels natural and not just silly. Do you know what I mean? So that was like one of the main things that I was worried about. And of course, it could just fall apart with a say community orchestra or semi-pro situation or whatever, or even a bunch of good players who just don't have enough time to practice it, right? Okay. So how is this all being dealt with? Is this smooth rather than awkward? I feel I really like the role of the oboes right in here, and the trading off to the clarinets and so on. I think that's really, really cool. That is a really great. And then here, you got the violas sort of doing something similar, that kind of middle voice sort of a thing, and I feel it's extremely effective, right? I almost feel like, like looking at what the oboes and so on are doing here, like I almost feel like, I wonder if like this could be doubled by bass clarinet, right? Just like a little bit further back in the tone picture. So like say, pianissimo crescendo to mezzo forte, right? And then I just think it would give just a little bit more weight and color right here in the middle. All right, and then here you got this, pizzicato, all cellos, and then sort of giving over the part to the violas right in here, which I would still want the bass clarinet to double this. So yeah, so I feel this is just a really strong reimagining of what happened previously. So here, like as we are heading towards a conclusion of the part, if this became like, let's say this was a faster speed, and it was getting more and more crescendo, kind of hammering away at these pairs of sixths. That is actually would be a very exciting thing, right? So I think that the firsts could come in doubling the seconds a little earlier, right? And this is so yeah, and once again I think crescendo, to an accent at the very least, is the way to go here. And this is kind of nice. The horns coming from behind. Yeah, and does this set up the next section? It does, because like now we get the new colors with the winds. But we will talk about that. That is a whole other thing. Okay. So now let's jump to bar 100 and look at the same exact phrase. Okay. So remember, we are coming off of this, and then all strings. So my one critique about this would be just that, like, as the okay, I promise I wouldn't do this, but I'm just going to mention it this once. Just once, I'm going to let you ask me about my business. No, just once I'm going to talk about proportions, okay? I promised that I would stay away from it, but I would just say, looking at the proportions of things, I would say that like the way that you've added excitement and added excitement and added excitement, just this seems to be very kind of downscaled. Do you know what I mean? Compared to what follows, right? And even if it were just like a timbral shift that was significantly different, but this is based so much on what happened before. Do you see what I mean? That I feel that it doesn't necessarily dramatically set this up. Now, of course, you might argue, well, Thomas, I was actually hoping for there to be a big contrast with this big tutti kind of a thing, and I think that's still achievable. It's just I feel that this is so much like what happened before, but even like down further in its character. But that is not to say that it's wrong or right, whatever. I just feel that the proportions are maybe something that need to be thought about a little bit more. Okay, and then with this, I just felt it was a very, very basic interpretation of the transcription of the original piano score. Nothing against it or anything. Just kind of the way that this is all set up, almost feels like it was copy pasted back to the beginning, or maybe the beginning was copy pasted to here, and then you went back and you worked on the beginning and cut out some things, and that's why there's a crescendo to nothing in the violas and so on in that earlier part. But anyways, I mean, there's nothing against this. It all works fine. Okay. All right. So now, trying to keep everything organized and nicely paced, just like the sonata itself, right? So now we are going to talk about these big bursts, right? Actually, I'm just gonna I think I'm gonna swap. Let's let's not talk about these big bursts of color. Let's talk about the section at double B and how it expands. And I'm going to shift that around in my in the way that I do my interpretations. Okay, so once again, direct transcriptions, impractical, choice of instruments depending on where a passage is positioned between other passages, depending on dynamics, direction of line up or down, how do these sections lead back to the other sections dramatically, and so on. Does interlocking / interdependent scoring between orchestral sections support headlong momentum but with precision and clarity? Should the momentary pauses from piano interpretations play a role in helping define the dramatic shape of the phrasing? Okay. So that last point, I won't go on about it too much, just to point out where it would really work well for you, right? And I already pointed out here, at least a slight pausa would help the room settle a little bit before we're going into and we talked about this before. It's like all strings and so on. And it has this kind of madcap kind of organization here before it goes back to da da dun 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 and so on. So we talked about that, and it was fairly effective, even though it was all strings. It was all fine. All right. So now let's jump ahead to bar 51. All right, and this is the kind of reverse direction one. Do, 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 do. And, I felt it was pretty effective. Like you're going from first to second to English horn. And, thinking about it just in terms, like, purely of, like, what can your players do before running out of breath, running out of focus, needing to change to another, take a breath or whatever. I would argue that you could take your first oboe up to this note here, and then you could have your English horn player come in here and do the second oboe part and then its own part, right? And then here you could have your first clarinet part play all the way to here, and then the second clarinet play this part, and then the first play that part, and so on. See what I mean? And then here, bass clarinet taking over, right? And then we get it to the big explosion. But, other than those things, I feel that the trading off is a little fast and furious, and it doesn't really accomplish anything in terms of like a very active swapping back and forth of different parts and different colors and everything like that, right? So that's just something that to watch out for. So I won't, but there's that. It's not worth. It's scored well enough, right? Okay. So now let's jump ahead to. Sorry, somebody closed my door. That wasn't my stomach groaning from not being fed enough. Okay, now let's jump ahead to bar 74. So notice, this is one of the things that gives pianists like Spencer Myer and other pianists who actually take even a bigger pause. Right? This is what gives them license to do that, is that Beethoven wrote a pause right into this bar. And it sort of is an indication that he might have, going bam, da 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 da, bam, da 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 da, and then just a slight pause right at the end, right? And I think that would actually, once again, I think that would, I don't see any big impetus pushing this right into this. Like it's like there's no crescendo, there isn't that little snare going, right? There isn't any need for this to not have a pausa, right? Okay, so now, like here, we're getting much more elaborate, and I think this is what I live for. This is so cool, and what I really love is the way that you have actually you've directly taken the different string groups and given them to different wind characters, right? So cellos going over to cellos and first bassoon, going over to violas and bass clarinet, very good combination. Going over to second violins and first oboe, I think that works pretty good. And then second flute, first violin. And I see, and here you're doing what I recommended earlier, just doing full bars of each player. Now, I would say you're going to get a way, way better dovetailing with just a single note, right? Because the quadrupling of pitches here will just create more distraction than is needed. Whereas if you have just a single note to dovetail from the instruments that are giving over to the instruments that are taking over, right? That's just much better than the way you got it scored here, right? And same thing here, single note dovetailing, single note dovetailing. And the same thing here in all these little things. Yeah, see here, single note, right? Just do that all the time. Yeah. Okay, so that takes us to the top here. Right, and then we're kind of sort of, it does this little thing where it starts to work its way back down again, right? And you got first clarinet going to second clarinet and so on, back and forth a bit, right, with your violins. And then here you bring in the glockenspiel, and I think that's just amazing. Glockenspiel, flute, and you only do like a few bars of just like little random. It's just, this is the stuff that's the hardest to rehearse. Do you know what I mean? Like, because the person is just counting and they're going one, right? One, and the other person's going 1, 2, and right? 1, 2, rest, rest, right? So just like coordinating all this together and just absolutely coming in exactly on the beat, is like, I wouldn't do it for more than like 3 or 4 bars, 2 at the most for me. But like here, I think this would still work, but you'd need some more rehearsal time, is all I would say. Okay. But, I think that it, like, here's the thing, is that, like, when you have this, like, crazy, like, and you just go bam, bum, bum, right at the end of it, like you kind of, I feel like it spoils the joke, right? If you just, but if you put a little space here at the end, it's sort of, the audience is like, what? And then, dun, 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 then it's kind of like Beethoven giving us permission to laugh at it, right? Rather than just coming right in on the end of it, it's like there isn't any time for reaction, right? So it's a dramatic thing, right? Okay. All right, so now let's jump ahead to 110, which is the other place where the strings work their way down. In this case, and this is all fine as it goes. Yeah, first going to seconds, going to violas, and you got these little staccatos right in here. I think that would work very, very well, right? And then here you just have this big boom. Once again, I don't know. All strings, maybe something to rethink. Okay. So that's all fine. Now, bar 133. All right. Which is our last and longest jump upwards. Now we've got something similar as before, cellos with the bass clarinet this time, and this time it's like the seams are in different places, right? And I think that's completely unnecessary. I think you could have had your cellos just stop here, and then and then dovetail straight into second violin, right? And then dovetail exactly right into first violin right on the down. But you just save yourself rehearsal time, right? And then that would match up with this. You have bass clarinet, and then going to first clarinet and second clarinet, and second clarinet, then first clarinet, and so on. And then, I almost feel like, piccolo could come in a little earlier, even though it's a kind of a weaker note. You know what I mean? But I don't know. Middle of the bar's okay to give the piccolo a little stronger, but then you don't get as long. Like the piccolo wasn't playing for very long before it suddenly contrasts. Right? If you're going to just stay in fortissimo, you could just have, you could dovetail to this bar being in flute, and then this bar being piccolo, and just completely cutting everything else out without dovetailing, right? All right, so, and then we just have these little back and forth things, right? And yeah, it's a bit more of that kind of thing going between the two parts, and just watch out, my friend, because it's just harder. It becomes harder and harder. However, once again, since you've got it at 120, it's a little bit more feasible, right? It's the tempo that really, the faster the tempo, the harder it is to really absolutely completely nail it. I wasn't so convinced by tambourine. I think a rolled suspend cymbal or suspended cymbal might be a little bit more effective there, especially not kind of getting in the way of the glimmering sheen of the glockenspiel right in there, right? So with the tambourine, you have all this glitter already from the hissing of the shakers, right? Whereas with a suspended cymbal, you have a boosh, like a sort of a whoosh coming from below, right? And it doesn't really get to be so penetrating that it drowns out the glockenspiel till right around the end, going to a fortissimo, right? So, anyways, that's just a possible aesthetic thing. So, anyways, I just feel that this is a bit risky. Do you know what I mean? But I mean, it's just written to be risky. But I see what you're doing here. You're going da 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 da. I would give the second player here the downbeat as well. Dun da 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 da. And then the first player going da 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 da. See what I mean? Rather than having the second player going rest da 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 da. I think just going da 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 da. It's just much easier. Okay. Alrighty, so yeah, so there's some risks here, but anyways, but like really working them out would be more of an orchestration lesson rather than just me coaching you and this being an evaluation and so on. So let's not get into it too much, but like intrinsically, there's nothing that doesn't work here. It's just really, it's hella tricky. Okay, so now. Now let's go back and look at those big explosive sections. So 57. All right. So we had these winds kind of coming downwards. Boom. Okay. All right, and the whole question here is consistency of strength rising through instrumental registers. That's one of the tricky ones, right? Because like the pianist can just have their hands walk up the keyboard and bring all the strength and all the consistency with them, but the strings and the winds rapidly run out of usable registers. Correct? Right. And then how do you score those worrying doubts? Then do you maintain the textural and rhythmic energy? And coming back to the worrying doubts again, right? All right, is this smooth rather than awkward, the way that this opens out? Right? Do we maintain that nervous energy? It's a bit like the B section, right? Hang on a second. Well, I think I went. Let's go back to where I was. I think I hit the wrong button here. All right, this is where I wanted it to go. All right, and then it's just like that B section, right? Or double B section. Is there textural dynamic expansion, maintaining energy throughout, and so on and so forth to set up this chord really well. All right, so it's pretty much like it's just scored practically identically in both sections for the piano part, right? So there isn't really just everything applies both times. All right, so let's apply those criteria to this. All right, so consistency of strength rising through instrumental registers. So bass clarinet. It's kind of interesting that you've got even though there's such a big crunch here, you've got no timpani, you got no tuba, you got no bassoons. Right? You're just going and I feel like you could have doubled this with tuba or contrabassoon, right? If we have can't remember if we have a contrabassoon now. Is there? Yes. See, you've got a contrabassoon playing a couple of notes here and there. All right. So I think that this is absolutely set up for contrabassoon right in here, and even just right in here. You could have them have the contrabassoonist playing staccato. Boop, 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 boop. You know what I'm saying? That's totally easy for them, right? Just as long as it doesn't go too insanely fast. Yeah. And I think it's kind of interesting the way that you have this sort of forte piano, right? I think this was... okay, the the difference in dynamics is bothering me here. Fortissimo piano, right? And the same thing here, fortissimo. And then here, if you want this just to be piano, I just think you need to work this out a little bit better in terms of like what comes in where, how strong it is, and so on. I would keep, I would not drop to piano till right here. And same thing here, fortissimo, fortissimo, and then maybe piano, like just maybe tie to the middle of the bar and then go piano there. And then just same thing here, fortissimo, piano here, right? I see what you're trying to do here. You're trying to not have the background and the strings be too strong, right? But it's, all the same, right? It's sort of like you're thinking of the wash of color from the pedal, and that's totally commendable. But I think you can overdo it by bringing it in a little too early. But this is really cool that the measured tremolo here, and then the clarinet's actually playing, or the first clarinet playing the actual broken pitches, broken chord pitches, taken over by oboe and then flute on top. I think this works really, really well. Yeah. With the second clarinet coming up from beneath. I know this looks awkward, but maybe the tie mark could have a little bit more of a curve to it, right? And then your little worrying doubts all in strings are totally fine. Maybe the cellos could be staccato along with the violas, right? And these worrying doubts do not have to be scored as separated slurs. I think it could be die, right? And then just basically you sort of do something similar again, right? And I feel like the second one, like you're trying to say something different, right? So like heavy brass, and with that, right, with the heavy brass coming in, pushing like this, you really are bringing in a completely different dynamic character as what happened before, right? So you just can't get away with doing this in your strings because they're meaningless, right? They don't support enough to compete with what's going on in your brass in the first place. In the second place, we're going to have a weaker kind of expression here because of the reasons that this has had a fortissimo arc. Now you've got piano crescendo to forte in the brass, and then mezzo forte in your cellos and so on. So this really just needs to be reworked. Fortissimo for all of your strings, hold on to it, right? And that is the only way that this is going to balance out. And you're wise to have more weight on this because of the way that your trumpets are going to interfere, right? Especially right in this bar right here, and yeah. But I mean, that's not to say that it's unworkable or anything like that. It's just this would be more work for the conductor the way that it's scored than this right in here. Yeah, but then worrying doubts with a little bit of English horn rather than the viola. I would actually just add the viola back in there, and once again have this staccato in the cellos. I don't know if there's any reason to give this this part right in here to the seconds, or even to do this like a little bit of second and a little bit of first and so on. There's no reason why the first violin can't just jump down to the F, right? It's totally easy. Yeah, I would either always have it in second violin or always have it in first violin, right, without worrying about the first violin jumping down. Maybe second is the way to go. Keep it in second violins. Okay. And then, continuing on, we have some of the same concerns that we had at the double B section. Is this a smooth rather than awkward kind of a line right here on top? And then, once again, like the pairs of instruments, or sorry, the pairs of slurs and so on. Yeah. But, I mean, then you've got the slower tempo, so I think that works pretty well. And you're swapping between flute and first and second flute, and yeah, I mean, think that this works all right. Right. And then adding horns and so on. And going back and forth between. Yeah, it pretty much works, I would say. Right. And then it's kind of strange, like you really only give the timpani and the snare drum a big crescendo forwards, right? Just feel like there could be some pressure pushing forwards from everybody right here. Right. Okay, all right. Well, let's not get too lost in that. Let's jump ahead to 116. All right, and and here we see some similar things that we did before, kind of like some of the brass approach that we had in the previous one, kind of matched up with the winds and so on. And so oboe's helping out with the worrying doubts, and English horn, kind of the same thing again, adding tuba at the bottom. That's kind of fun. I think that helps a lot. I mean, could this be like with contrabassoon the first time, since it's kind of sitting around doing nothing? And then answering tuba afterwards. This is going to be a very, very heavy note right here. Just so you're aware. Right. And, kind of very similar to the same approach as before. Horns coming in. Right. And then more. So this is what's missing from a lot of these things, like crescendo forwards, right? So you're just going crescendo to forte here, but I feel everybody should go crescendo to a fortissimo, right? The trill is very cool right in here, and this little trill in the piccolo is very cute with the glockenspiel. Yeah, so that all works for me. I think it's quite charming, actually. I like the timpani placed very high here. Yeah, accent for everybody at the end, right? Including the timpani. All right, cool. So now let's look at the final development going to the very end, right? And I have a specific set of criteria for this as well. Building forward with graceful poise and cooler colors. Natural emphasis, not getting too hot. I sort of asked, does this capture the pensive character of the piano part? Is a direct transcription necessary? I think that I might have posited this, maybe even in the Pitfalls video. I might have talked about how just bringing in a harp for just one bar is maybe not the greatest thing for the orchestra manager to have to figure out how they're going to pay them. Unless the harp is just sort of sitting around anyways. And then, of course, like them sitting around for a rehearsal where they're just used for one bar, even if it's part of a rehearsal where they have a big part, they still have to get paid for that rehearsal time. All right, and then, is there a way of referencing previous approaches as a culmination rather than just as a repetition, right? So we're going to think about all those things. All right, and then jump back to... Dun, 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 dun. And I like the way that you're just, you're basically, you're kind of using that bum bum ba bum bum dun 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 dun. I just really like the, just like the more thoughtful, soft trombones and horns right here. A little bit like as things start to push and brighten and so on and so forth, you start to bring in trumpets and oboes, and so that there'll be a cooler color on top because of the clarinets, right? But yeah, but like here, like you just really bring in the upper strings, and just a little bit of bassoon below here. Well, one thing I would point out is just because there isn't any bass in the piano part doesn't mean that there can't be any bass in the orchestra part, right? So you have a little bit right in here, and I mean I can see like the way that you aesthetically balance this. You're really kind of holding off on it, just giving it a taste here, and then that way that like this can have more emotional meaning. So that passes the sniff test for me. Da 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 bum 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 bum. Strings, bassoon, flutes and oboes, and a little bit of trumpet in the middle. Yeah. Okay. So the the I would work on the voicing of this chord a little bit. Okay, it just didn't. Yeah, you have to be careful when you stack chords like this. Okay, so just be careful. Like rather than having the same chord replicated at two different registers in the orchestra, it would be better to interpret the chord across the harmony across all the registers of the. Do you see what I'm saying? Like some of these complex chords can't you know can't so easily like diminished chords, for instance, or so on. It's like with the particular voicing, the meaning of what Beethoven is trying to imply, of like in terms of the voice leading and everything else, like this chord just does not convey, right? So just really be careful. Listen to the sense of where things are leading you. Okay. And this was also a little strange. Like I think you might have gotten the harmony wrong here, or maybe you were thinking of a different, like a possibly sort of more jazzy harmony. But yeah. Yeah, and then just like the harp. I've already said what I wanted to about that. Right, and then here. Okay, so yeah, so higher speed. This is very. I mean, even at 120, it's not the easiest thing in the world to do these broken octaves. It might be a way easier just to have your strings be hammering out repeated sixteenths rather than this kind of these back and forth octaves here. Yeah. And also just like in general, I would say as we're sort of driving towards the ending, you're keeping pitches like centered around where they are harmonically, rather than like the kind of the noodling that Beethoven does, right? That's the one thing that I would say, that like if you were going to subject this to a rewrite, I would just really try to work with a little bit more. See, like your brass scoring in here is way better, I think, than the wind and string scoring, right? Because you are apparently more aware of the limitations right there. Well, some of those same limitations apply to the winds and the strings. Like so here, for instance, I would say like the flutes are technically a lot easier, right? But then like there's some parts of the oboes, these broken sixths and so on. I mean, they're playable. It's just it's like I mean, you have to think like what is the timbre of the instrument as it does that, and then the clarinet. I'm not so sure about that too, because it's just like there'll be a tendency for this to be sped up by the conductor too, right? So just like would that even work, right? Or do you want something that sort of is forcibly slightly slower? So yeah. So anyways, I mean, there's still some problems in here. I'm not so convinced by the pizzicato violas in here. I think they just get completely swallowed by what's going on here in your second trombone, right? And then and then the bass trombone and tuba coming in too is just going to wipe it out. it might be a lot more effective of a viola part just to double what's going on here in the second violins. Yeah. So anyway, so just not totally convinced by this ending part, but it's like its heart is in the right place. But once again, we would kind of need a bit of an orchestration lesson to like really work out, or a coaching session or something like that, to really work out all the bugs. But still, it's like it it's almost there. There's just a few things that need to be figured out. So anyway, so in conclusion, it's funny, this, like, I've just been talking for about 75 minutes or so about this, and yet, like, I just feel that there is so much going on in this orchestration and in the source material and just the pacing of everything. I just feel swept away every time I sit down to evaluate one of these, and yeah, it does take energy to do. It's not the easiest thing, but it's still so much fun. It's like it's like a circus ride or something like that. Like a, So I really enjoyed this, Adrian, and you have so many things in here, so many ideas. I mean, it's a goodie box, right? It's a cornucopia of different approaches and different, like, you just really are using so many different ideas. It's like it almost would require a couple of hours to cover everything that every possible approach and every innovation and every development and every and everything. And I mean, as it should be, right? Except that I have limited time and energy. But look, thank you so much for being so patient and so kind and considerate. You were one of those people out there who just, like, you saw the reality of the situation for me, and you were really supportive. And that was extremely meaningful for me. I thank you so much for that, and for your patience, and and for commenting on other people's scores and keeping up the energy and everything else. I just really, really appreciate it. And everybody out there who's still with me, you know what to do, right? Comment below, please. Give Adrian your best feedback, even if it's just to say, hey, I liked what you did here. Or, if you've got some ideas, some things I missed or wasn't able to go over just due to time, some thoughts of your own as players of these instruments, things that could help him in scoring his wind, strings, and brass a little bit more effectively, if needed. And I will just see you tomorrow with another really great score. There's such cool conceptions coming up, and interpretations, and and just everybody's got such a different voice on this and such a different idea that there's not a boring moment. See you then.